All right. Welcome, everybody. Happy Friday. You've made it through the first full week of the semester and the second week overall. So, just 12 more weeks to go. And when you put it like that, it doesn't sound so terrible, does it? Or maybe it does. I don't know. Okay. So we finished up with sort of our preliminary topic on Wednesday, and we're going to start talking some research design in this lecture, and again on Monday and probably Wednesday, which will set you up nicely for your first lab with L'Oreal on Thursday. All right, before I jump in, I have no idea. I've not been keeping an eye on the class list. Is there anyone who has any questions about the course at all, or anything you want to jump into before I cover what I'm sure will be a very fascinating subject on a Friday afternoon? Good? Okay. All right. So research design, right? When you're talking about research design, you're sort of thinking about, you have a research question, right? So we talked about coming up with your research question last time. The research design is all about figuring out how you're going to take that research design and make it work, right? So how are you actually going to now get the information that you are looking for, right? So your research design, it's your framework for how you're going to collect and analyze your data. And so you got to figure out, what do you want to learn? What is it you're trying to find out from this particular research design? What is the nature of your research question? What kind of sociological research is this going to essentially be? And what kind of explanation do you want to come out of it? So, what kind of, and I'll explain these terms, nomothetic and ideographic, in a second. What do you want in terms of the explanation, right? And so you could have, explanations that are generalized, right? Or generalizable. Sorry, there's a lag on my pen. I probably have too many tabs open in my browsers. Like 200. Generalizable or, context specific, right? And this is going to have to do with what kind of research design you're going to come up with. And again, not like, I think we tend to think of generalizability as the gold standard in research, but sometimes, only being able to talk about a specific context is okay as well. Okay, so depending on what you're looking for, right, you're either going to have a nomothetic or idiographic explanation. Okay, so nomothetic, right? Basically, nomothetic explanations involve attribution of cause and effect, expressed in general laws and principles. So this is, of course, more quantitative. And generally, you're talking about, suggesting that there's a correlation, or, if you have a really, really strong case that you have causation, but typically, we're going to talk about correlation in sociology. But basically, you can say, X, whatever it is causing Y. So social media use, right? Social media use is causing anxiety, depression, and let's just leave it at anxiety and depression amongst the population that you're talking about, right? So there's a cause and effect relationship. The more time someone spends on social media, the more likely they are to be depressed, right? Or to be anxious, or to be lonely, or whatever it happens to be. So that's basically a nomothetic explanation, right? Some kind of attribution of cause and effect and that's the relationship. One variable is causing the effects on one or several other variables. Okay, now, generally speaking, and this is, is my next one idiographic? Okay, yeah, so I have everything self-contained here. Generally speaking, nomothetic explanations need to have, to satisfy 3 criteria of causation, right? So there has to be a correlation between at least 2 of the variables, right? And obviously you can do things like multivariate regressions, right? So you're looking at, the effect of multiple variables on each other, but there has to be a correlation between the 2 of them, or 2 or more factors, right? So as, X changes, there's also a change in Y, right? So if, for example, or, sometimes expressed in these terms, the independent variable, as you change your independent variable, there has to be a change in your dependent variable as well, right? And just like an example that'll come up a little bit later is, say, a kind of a psychology lab experiment, people wanted to test whether the amount of caffeine given to someone in their 20s increases the amount or the number of items on a list they're able to remember, right? So they, basically do a baseline, and then they give you a can of Red Bull. So, they test you and they're like, okay, memorize as many items on this list as you can in the next minute, and then write them back, flip it over, write them back down. Okay. And then they're like, okay, well, now we're going to try it again, but first chug this Red Bull, right? So that would be your independent variable. And then they're going to have you do the experiment again once the caffeine kicks in, right? So give it about 20 minutes. And so that's the change in your caffeination here would be your independent variable. If there's no change in the dependent variable, so, before I remembered 15 words, and after chugging a Red Bull, I still remember 15 words, you would fail the correlation test, right? There'd be no correlation between the variables, right? No effect. So, that's a really simplistic way of kind of explaining it, but that would be, you would fail the correlation test, right? There's no correlation between amount of caffeine and a number of words. Or say, you did the same experiment and, one time, like before I have the Red Bull, I remember 15 words off the list. After the Red Bull, I remember 11. Then you repeat the experiment, and then I remember 13, and then I remember 9, and then I remember 20, right? You could say it's all over the place. There's no link between those 2 variables. So it fails a test of correlation, right? There's no connection between the 2. Right, does that make sense? All right, I know it's pretty basic. The other one is time order, right? So time order, basically a change in, say, and this applies especially to like lab, to kind of lab research, although you can use it in kind of broader social studies as well. But if you have you have to have the time order basically in effect. So if you're, some kind of study and you're thinking like, okay, even like if you're doing like a historical study and you're like, length of parents' marriage on overall kind of rates of marriage for children, right? And you said you think that there's a correlation, but what you find or actually, hang on, let me change that. I'm going to change that really quickly. So let's say parents' marital status on academic achievement, and you want to map this out over time, right? So you want to see how the rise of divorce as a kind of normative life path has changed things in terms of children's academic achievement. And you're like, you think there's a correlation because over time, as more people have gotten divorced, academic achievement in young people has actually, gone down. But what might happen is, and you see this sometimes, the change in the dependent variable, so here academic achievement, might start before, say, the change in marital status, normal marital status. And then you'd have to say that it fails the kind of time order test, right? Or in a sort of classic example, ice cream sales go up and murders also go up, but if the murders started to go up before the ice cream sales went up, then you'd have to say, okay, it's clearly not the sale of ice cream that's causing more people to commit murders, because the murders started prior to the increase in ice cream sales, right? So the time order has to match. If the change in your independent variable happens after changes start in your dependent variable, then you can't say that the two are time ordered, right? So change in independent has to happen before dependent variable. So that otherwise you fail the time order test and you're dealing with something else that'd be causing the change in your dependent variable. Okay, and so does that make sense? I know I muddled my way through that explanation. I love the ice cream and murder example because it's that classic sociological example, specifically of a spurious relationship. Okay, so your relationship has to be non-spurious, which means that there is not a third or other factor affecting the change in the dependent variable, right? So, I'm sure you've heard this, right? This is the classic, ice cream sales increase. So ice cream, that's an ice cream, by the way. And, oops, I went to the next slide. And murder. I'm just going to put a big M for murder. I was going to draw a gun, but I didn't want to be too aggressive, right? So you could then sort of draw, ice cream sales increased, and then murders increased, or maybe they increased at the same time. So it fits the time order and fits the correlation. But in that case, and this is a classic example from textbooks, right? One of the problems would be that obviously ice cream and murder aren't inherently connected, right? It's not like there's chemicals that actually, looking at the list of ingredients on ice cream, maybe there are murder-making chemicals in ice cream, I don't know. But generally speaking, right, there's no reason that ice cream sales increases should cause an increase in murders. In this case, there's a third intervening variable that's causing the change in your dependent variable, which is, anybody ever remember hearing this example before? It's heat, right? When it gets hot, I'm going to draw the sun because I'm good at art and I can draw a circle with a bunch of lines around it. Heat, right? When it gets hot outside, ice cream sales increase, obviously, because people want ice cream to cool off, and it's a nice summer treat for everyone. And murders also increase because more people are outside, right? So less people are in their homes, more people venture outside. Heat tends to put people in kind of a bad mood, right? So people get grumpy when they get really hot and can't cool off, and they're outside, and they're finally meeting their neighbors who they've been avoiding all year because their neighbors are jerks. And then murders go up, or people are just passing by on the street downtown or on white and exposing themselves to greater risk of being murdered. So in this case, right, the actual thing causing the increase in ice cream sales and the increase in murders is a spurious variable, right? Or a third variable causing the change in either one or both. So in order to, and now I'm going to erase all this. In order to say that you have an authentic relationship, right, it has to be non-spurious. There can't be another variable intervening. Now that can sometimes be hard to detect, right? It takes a little bit of work to figure out, sometimes that you have a spurious relationship, but you can only say, you have a cause and effect relationship if you meet all three of these criteria. Okay, I'm sure that, how's that? That's okay? Makes sense? All right. So idiographic explanations, and this should be a little bit quicker to explain. Idiographic, right? So it has the same root as like linguistic systems or writing systems that, like an ideogram or an ideograph is a picture that represents an idea. Idiographic kind of explanations, somewhat similar, but the idea is that instead of explaining things, in terms of numbers and a cause and effect relationship, you're writing a rich description of a person or group, and seek to explain the particular kind of circumstances. So this sometimes you might hear referred to like more colloquially, when people are giving a idiographic explanation, people are often doing what's called a case study, right? So when someone says they're doing a case study, right, they're going to give you a rich, detailed explanation of a particular social circumstance, and they're going to give it to you in words, right? So idiographic is always in words, and it's generally a detailed account, right? So it's going to give you things like context, so it's going to give you a lot of context. It's going to richly describe, what people told you, the environment they're in, socioeconomic status, historical context, all sorts of things in which you're situating your particular study. Okay, now generally speaking, right, these are qualitative studies. At least in theory, our nomothetic explanations are generalizable, right? Because typically speaking, you would be wanting to gather enough data that is representative of the whole population. There's whole formulas to figure this out. Don't worry, we'll talk about it. But I won't make you do the math. And actually, increasingly, there's really great tools online to figure out like what an adequate sample size would be for a quantitative study. In fact, SurveyMonkey has a pretty decent one. You can just look it up. SurveyMonkey, survey size tool, works really well. So idiographic explanations, generally speaking, are only going to apply to the person or groups who are part of the study. Sometimes you'll be able to say, link it to other groups. So you might, if you're doing a study of, let's say Ukrainian people who have come to Canada as, refugees or asylum seekers, you might be able to say, well, there might be some parallels with other asylum seekers who've come to Canada from other places, but we'll have to, do research and see where the two line up. But generally speaking, you're talking just about that group, like it applies just to that group. You can't generalize it out to any population outside of the one that you specifically looked at, right? Whereas if you, are doing sort of quantitative research and nomothetic explanations, you might be able to say, okay, because we took a representative sample of all Canadians, right, we can say that these findings represent the Canadian population as a whole, or, Edmontonians as a whole, or Albertans as a whole, and all of that. Okay. Good, I haven't put you to sleep yet? All right. For you, yes. Whoever you are. No. Yeah, that's funny, sorry. I get a good chuckle out of that. Labs are not mandatory. They're there to help you. They're there to kind of walk you through, You're going to do kind of activities to build things like research questions, survey questions, research design, with L'Oreal. And it's there so that you get a couple of cracks at it before you submit that. So you're going to take a crack at it, as a group in the lab. You can use your combined intelligence to come up with, a survey questions or whatever it has to be, whatever it happens to be that week. And then you're going to submit the mini lab, and you'll get feedback on that from either L'Oreal or myself. And then, so you've had 2 cracks at it, at whatever skill we're working on in the lab before you go and actually submit the assignment on which you're going to be graded. So the idea is, lots of practice before you have to, actually submit something for grading. If you choose not to do that, we're not taking attendance because we're not in grade 4, and I'm not going to call your mom and tell her you didn't come to class either. It's up to you, you're adults, right? So and if you don't have time, that's your choice. We're not policing it. I will say, if for whatever reason you can't make it to the lab that you're assigned to, but you want to go to the other one, right? Because there's 2. There's one at 9 and there's one at, is it at 2? At 2, right? And they're both on Thursday, both next door. You can go to the other one if you have the time, right? We're not taking attendance. We're not checking that you're in the correct section of the lab, and all of that stuff. So, and it's only 6 times in the year. So I would strongly recommend going. I think it's worthwhile, but I can already tell by asking if it's mandatory that maybe someone's thinking of not going. It is what it is. Okay. So once you figured out like what kind of research question you have, whether you're looking for a nomothetic or idiographic explanation at the end of it, you then have to select a methodology, right? Now, this is not an exhaustive list of methods. There's a few others that we're going to talk about, but and like I'll say, semi-structured interview should be on there. And they all have their own purposes. They all have their own strengths and weaknesses. There's reasons to use any different kinds. Now, generally speaking, right, if you're in an not a nomothetic explanation, right, you're doing quantitative research, probably the most common tool you're going to use is a questionnaire, or, more colloquially referred to as a survey. And I just call them surveys. But questionnaire, survey, interchangeable terms. I go with survey. The textbook, I think, talks about questionnaires, but they're the same thing, right? Okay, so you don't want to do quantitative research. A survey or questionnaire is typically a good tool. The other one you might use is existing data sets, right? Instead of doing your own survey, you might go and take the results of someone else's, depending on, scope and availability and all of those sorts of things. You could do both, right? But anyway, let's not overcomplicate it. Structured interviews, right, which is basically a questionnaire that you administer in person. Structured interview where you don't really ask any follow-up questions, you're just following a script. So that would be, a couple of forms. You could do structured observation as well. There's a few different ones. We'll talk about a few as we go through. By far the most common one in sociology is a questionnaire. And then on the qualitative side, right, if you're wanting to find out about people's experiences, actually experimental might be kind of in the gray zone. It might be more quantitative. I'll tell you why we don't really do experiments in sociology, but that's something for another time, or for a couple slides from now. Participant observation, right? You might go and watch people or interact with them in a couple of different ways. An ethnography, semi-structured interviews, right, are probably the most used qualitative tool, where you just ask people to talk to you and you sit down with them for an hour or two and you ask them, you have a set of questions, but you kind of ask follow-up questions and follow the conversation down rabbit holes. We'll talk about those as well. But yeah, depending on what kind of study you want to do, you're going to pick a method that's going to get you that information. And that's always the question: which of these tools is going to get me, the the data that I want, the explanations that I want, and hopefully, in the most efficient way possible. Because you don't want to live your whole life doing research. Okay. Does that make sense? All right. I said that, I looked up and I didn't wait for a response. I'm sorry. It's Friday. It's Friday. Okay, I'm going to talk about experiments, and I'm going to talk about like a caveat. So we're going to talk experimental design, because it's revealing in some ways of how research is done. But with this caveat, right? True experiments are really common in psychology and like organizational studies, right? So some branches of business that are interested in like how businesses are organized and these sorts of things, but pretty rare in sociology and political science. And the simple reason is, right, sociology is mostly interested in people as they are in society. And the second that you put people into a kind of experimental setting, immediately you introduce an element of artifice, right? And so you bring in what's called reactivity, where people are maybe more reacting to the experimental design rather than authentically, say, reacting to a stimulus or a situation. That is why, by the way, sociology is better than psychology. No, I'm kidding. I'm joking. Oh, I love that joke. I love kind of cutting down psychology. I don't know why. It's just fun. I will say it's probably because my first experience of psychology was Psych 104, a class in which the grad student that was teaching it talked to us every single week about her sexual escapades all the time. And, it was the most bizarre class I ever took. This person was legitimately a nymphomaniac. And every class she was like, yeah, so before I start, I just need to tell you about this guy I was sleeping with last night and how this explains the concept we're talking about today. And we were like, first semester, first year. It's a great introduction to psychology, right? And I'll never forget that. And I wish I knew her name because I'd love to look up what happened to her because I'm genuinely curious. But I believe that information is now lost to the sands of time. Okay, so yes, psychology is a garbage discipline and no one should take it. But aside from that, I'm kidding. Okay, I know it's like a room inevitably that has half full of psych, major, minors in some combination. So that joke kills about half of you. Okay, so why don't we do experiments in sociology? Like I said, we're generally interested more in kind of natural social circumstances. And a lot of things, when you're talking about society or big groups, it's really difficult to actually manipulate variables, right? So it's hard to get an independent variable that you can control very precisely in the way that a lot of psychology lab experiments tend to, right? Like the experiment I was describing before, caffeination and how many words you remember, or how well you can do math problems. You can control the independent variable really easily there because you can, introduce caffeine. You can give people more caffeine and see how they respond up to a certain point. So yeah, in social circumstances though, it can be really difficult, right? If you want to say like, what's the effect of religiosity on, loneliness, happiness, and anxiety, manipulating religiosity is essentially impossible, right? You can measure it, but you can't manipulate it in an experimental setting. Okay, so ethical concerns preclude performing experiments. And yeah, there's lots of examples of experiments that were conducted really, really unethically, right? And so it can be really difficult, especially on a wide scale with large groups, to get ethics approval to perform big scale experiments. So ethical considerations are a concern. We'll talk about it when we get to ethics too, because there's lots of fun examples of where, okay, one of them, right? It's always brought up in like SOC 100 and intro psychology classes, even though it shouldn't be because it's garbage. What am I talking about? Do you know what I'm talking about? Stanford prison experiment. There you go. You knew what I was talking about, right? There's real ethics, in terms of putting people in situations where they might be harmed, even psychologically, to see like, what are the group dynamics when I give someone power over someone else, right? So there's been a long history of, even though Stanford's been largely debunked, because basically the researchers were like, to the people who are going to be the guards, it's like, I just need you to crank the abuse up 5%. I need you to be really abusive. They kind of, structured the experiment so that, and told people what they wanted them to do. But either way, right, it's unethical to put people in a circumstance where potentially they might experience some kind of trauma or harm. So there's real limitations on experimental design. And this has gotten, when we talk about ethics, the standards of ethics today in terms of research ethics are so much higher than they were in the past. Okay, a lot of phenomena, of interest have long-term complex causes, that you couldn't simulate in an experiment, right? When you're talking about, social causes and, you're talking about things that have unfolded over history, you can't manipulate them in a short time frame. And I'll just leave it at that. Yeah, and even where you can do them, experimental models do not always get at the perceptions and feeling of research subjects, specifically because sometimes there's reactivity, right? I'll write it up here. The bottom of my screen doesn't take input as well. Reactivity, right? Because sometimes people are reacting to the experiment rather than, giving authentic circumstances. Now there are, and I will say, I had this debate with Phil, who also is Phil Badwi, who's also a professor in the department, and I was like, maybe we shouldn't even teach experimental kind of design. And he's like, well, but there are a few examples in sociology of where experimental designs do reveal something interesting, right? And they've done these experiments where, they provide the same resume for the same job, but one has the name of like, John Smith, and one has an ethnic sounding name, usually a black name, LaQuisha or something like that, 2 apostrophes. No, I'm joking, but right, they put a black name, a stereotypically black name on the application, and they see how people react to that name. Or they have someone, with a white sounding name like John Smith, who's black, go in and apply for this job, and they watch the perception of people. And it's revealed, some implicit bias in the way people deal with, resumes, hiring, bank loans, those kinds of things. And these are sociological experiments that have a lot of virtue. But I would say they're more the exception than the rule. Most typically, right, they're really difficult to structure in such a way as to be ethical, for one, and to really reveal results in a kind of natural way. Okay. All right, so there's 2 kinds of experiments that you can talk about. How am I doing oh, wow, it's 1:30. I've gotten through all these slides. Friday's going great. Okay. 2 kinds of experiments. Field experiments, right, conducted in real world surroundings. So like the one that I was talking about, right, where you go in to apply for a bank loan and the paperwork's all filled out with like a very generic name like John Smith, and the person comes in and they're black, just to see the reaction of the loan officer, right? That's a sort of field experiment, right, where you're out in the real world. There's lots of other kind of real world experiments, seeing how people react to things. A famous one is like the subway violinist experiment, where they did it in New York, and they had, in one circumstance, same violinist, concert violinist with the New York Philharmonic, down in the subway, and in one case he's dressed in a tuxedo, in one case he's dressed as a homeless person, right? And seeing how people react to the same person playing the same instrument, the same way, but with different clothing, right? How would that be perceived by people when watching them? There's also things like the subway stairs experiments, right? Where they put like piano keys on stairs, that when people would walk on them, they would play music to see how people reacted to suddenly the stairs they're walking on playing music. But you're basically looking at, in a real world scenario, how people would react. Now, of course, there's lots of problems with field experiments. You have no control group. You can't control, you don't know who your population is that's going to be moving through a particular area a lot of the time. Even if you're applying to a bank, to TD Bank, you don't know who your loan officer is. Sorry, my mouth ran away. You don't necessarily know, who the loan officer is going to be, what their background would be, any of that stuff. So you don't control all of the variables. So, there's limits to them. Okay. With that, okay, I think that's enough on that. Lab experiments, right? These are the things that I don't know if it's this way still. It was when I did my Psych 104, 105. They have some grad student doing some kind of experiment in a controlled environment, and they rope the students in Psych 104, 105 into doing them for credit, or they did when I was doing my undergrad. But it's a controlled research environment, right? They're going to bring you into some kind of controlled environment. They have control groups. They can randomly assign research subjects, and therefore they have higher internal validity. Pretty easy to replicate, right? So the one I was talking about, the caffeine memory kind of experiment, it would be easy. If you have the procedure, you could easily replicate that study. And you can have your control group, right? So a group that you give caffeine to and a group that you give a non-caffeinated beverage to, and see if there's any difference. So it's a lot easier to control. However, typically weak external validity, right? A lot of it is only going to apply probably to the lab setting because you're creating so many artificial circumstances that often it's hard to say what the real world application of these things would be. And we can talk about some of those as we go forward. What is the difference between participant observation and ethnography? It's a good question. Participant observation is sort of a form, it's a part of ethnography typically, or one particular kind of ethnography. And ethnography can be, it's kind of an umbrella term that can often involve a bunch of different things. So for example, under ethnography, you might have both participant observation, right, where you're essentially hanging out with people. Let's say you don your full body furry suit and you head down to the Edmonton Furry Con and live amongst the furries and make your observations. But you might also include in ethnography interviews, right? Whereas if you're just doing a strict participant observation, you would stick to, kind of observing a social circumstance. And there's different levels of it, which we'll come to in the second half of the course. But yeah, ethnography can have other components than just the observation component. And a lot of ethnographies, most I would say, also have a semi-structured interview component to them to kind of give you more detail and give you more access to what people are thinking. Okay, that's a good question. They often are kind of used interchangeably, so the terms can be a little bit confusing. Okay. So, key concepts for experiments, right? Okay, so you have the experimental or treatment group. So this is the group that is exposed to your independent variable, right? Or receives a treatment or manipulation of some kind, right? So this is the group that, after you get your baseline, you do your pre-test, you give them a Red Bull and see if it changes how many words on a list they can memorize, right? So that is the group that receives the treatment, right? Or in good experiments, there should be a treatment group and a control group. The control group, right, is the one that doesn't get the treatment. So these guys in the same experiment, they get a Sprite, right? Or something, a root beer, or something innocuous, a drink that doesn't contain caffeine. And you see if there's any improvement on the task, right? Because maybe it's just as you practice a task, like remembering a list of names, maybe the second and third and subsequent times, you just get better at it. So if you only have your experimental group, you might be like, aha, caffeine does improve people's mental acuity and therefore they remember more names on the list. You have a control group because maybe what you find is actually, oh, we gave this group a non-caffeinated beverage, but just the fact that they now knew what they were supposed to do and they practiced it a few times, made them better at it. So, you might find there's no correlation between, Red Bull. Or actually the grad students now have become enamored with Celsius for some reason. It's like everyone's shaking their head. I've never had one because yuck. I don't like energy drinks. They make me feel weird. But yeah, apparently Celsius is the new hotness when it comes to energy drinks. But whatever, right? A large amount of caffeine and industrial chemicals to make your brain go, to dance a little bit. All right, but you might find that these two are more or less equivalent or the differences aren't substantial. And then you have to be like, okay, there's obviously something else going on. So control groups are really, really important for figuring out in experimental design if you actually have an effect, right? If your independent variable is actually causing the change to your dependent variable. Okay, random assignment. So generally speaking, in order that you can't skew the results of a study, you're supposed to randomly assign people to either the experimental or control group, right? So if you get 100 people signed up to your experiment, you're a grad student in psychology and you're doing this experiment and you want 100 people to sign up, you get your 100 people, you assign randomly. So you would assign them like numbers, right? And then randomly assign those numbers into either group. Basically, and you can do this with computer programs now, but basically that's so you don't look at people and you're like, I think these people are smarter than those people. I'm going to put them in that group because I really need to find results, because I really need good results, because I need to write my dissertation and finally get out of here, right? And if I don't come up with good results from this experiment, I'm going to be here another 5 years. So you randomly assign them into either the control or the experimental group using some kind of random method, and there's lots of different ones, basically so that you can't skew the data, right? So you're not in control of the data. You should have kind of a random population in either group. Okay, and then pre-tests, kind of what I'm describing. If you do the test before you give them the Red Bull or Celsius or whatever, a measure of the dependent variable before the experimental manipulation, right? So you're trying to find out what's their baseline, so you can then judge the increase in their baseline after they get an energy drink. And then a post-test measurement of the dependent variable after the manipulation. So here you've had your energy drink, and you then test them again to see if there's been a change in that dependent variable, right? The DV, the memorization of the list of names. Okay, does that all make sense? I know it's pretty straightforward. So, all right. See, I told you, I have this example elsewhere. So, right, we got our caffeine, our number of words recalled. So causality basically is at the core, of a lot of different social science research, both quantitative and qualitative, though I'd say causation or, correlation is much more important typically in quantitative research. And usually you express it in the language of variables, and variables can be just about anything, right? Characteristics or attributes of data that vary or change. So, in lab designs or lab experiments, it's very simple, right? Because you have, your independent variable, the thing you're introducing, and your dependent variable, the thing that you're watching for an effect for. When you get into statistical research, right, using survey research, this changes a little bit. You still use the language of dependent and independent variables, but it looks a lot different, right? Because you actually aren't manipulating your independent variable, right? If you're doing a statistical study using a survey method. But, you're probably measuring different states of, say, your independent variable, right? So let's just say, like, a really crude example, age to religiosity. You can't really manipulate people's age, but you can look at, what 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20, usually you put in a range, like 18 to 25, 26 to 30, you'd actually make these much more uniform in terms of their distribution, but we'll talk about that later. And then different age categories, and you would measure a bunch of things like, how often people attend religious services, pray, interact with sacred books or scriptures or whatever, what they believe, all sorts of stuff like that, right? So you'd be measuring, the effect of age on religiosity, but you're not, and so age is your independent variable, and religiosity is your dependent variable. But you're not manipulating age, right? You're just measuring it at different points for different people. So statistically, you're sort of playing with it, but you're not, you didn't cause people to age, obviously, because that would be silly. So we still use this, when we talk about statistical research, we still use a lot of this language, independent variable, dependent variable, but we're not manipulating it in the same way as you would, say, in a lab study. So just keep that in mind. Okay. Yeah, so independent variables, I think you've already picked up on this, are the ones that are manipulated to see if they have an effect on the dependent variable, right? In lab research, in statistical research, it's, at different states, what would be the effect on, another variable, right? So you could say even religiosity, what is the effect of being more religious based on some kind of measure you have on loneliness, right? You could measure all of those things, and in that case, you'd be using the same language, even though you're just measuring one thing and seeing whether, more or less of that thing would lead to, a different measure of this, right? Okay, does that make sense? I haven't lost you completely? Okay, I know, you're all very smart, and this is very basic, but still helps to go through it. Okay, and yeah, like our example, right, caffeine, to word memorization. Caffeine is the independent variable. Word memorization is the dependent. Headache, pain, right? Taking a Tylenol is the independent variable. The dependent variable is the level of pain that someone feels, after the drug has kicked in, right? So it's pretty basic, pretty simple. All right, 5 minutes left. Okay, I've got a few left on this. I'll try to get through a little bit more of this, and we'll continue on Monday. So, sorry, was that a hand up, Marie? Okay. Classic design, right? Your independent and dependent variables are identified. The dependent variable is observed and measured pre-test in the control group and the experimental or treatment or experimental group at what's called T1, right? T1. The treatment group receives the treatment while the control group doesn't, right? Or receives a placebo. Sometimes you'll do like a placebo. So like in the example I gave, Sprite would be kind of a placebo. Okay, and then the dependent variable is observed or measured in a post-test at time 2, right? So you measure it again at time 2, and you record any changes in each group is noted. That's a classic experimental design. Okay, so do I have, all right. I'll explain this to you. This is actually an interesting one, and this is in a way a little bit more of a sociological kind of experimental design. So again, it can tell us something potentially about where you could use this in a sociological context. All right, so this is a very famous study as well, where basically the researchers went into public schools in the US, and they administered an IQ test. And then delivered the results to the teachers. Now, the results of the IQ tests actually that they gave were actually fake. So they put in fake scores and randomly assigned them to students within the groups, and then they reported them to the teachers. And those that they said basically were very smart, had scored really high on their IQ test. Okay, I will say the experimenters actually did have the IQ test, right? So they had a measure of the student's IQ. But in some people who they called the spurters, they basically reported a higher IQ than their IQ showed, and basically told the teachers that obviously these kids were very smart and were underperforming their actual intelligence. And then, they had another group which they gave sort of average IQs, which they called the non-spurters, right? And basically what they did was they had their first IQ test here. They told the teacher, something about this student, right? Oh, they're very smart. They're actually, underperforming, whatever. And that created, teacher expectations that, this kid was actually really smart and probably just needed extra support. And here, because it was like, yeah, actually that kid's pretty average, no expectation was created. And they measured IQ again at T2, right, 8 months later. And what they found was, that for the most part within their experimental group, IQ went up. And for, the non-spurters, their control group, IQ stayed the same, right? So it was about the same. And so what did they conclude from this study was that in a lot of cases, teacher expectations of student potential actually is a factor in how much time teachers spend. So the teachers who expected that, these students in the experimental group were much smarter gave them extra support, right, to try and help them achieve the potential that had been measured, here, and told them that they were actually, much smarter than their IQ test or than their academic progress or was showing. So once given extra attention and extra help, they actually scored higher on IQ tests because they were getting that extra help that they needed to progress. Whereas with no expectation, the teacher was like, whatever, they're just a dummy. Nothing's ever going to happen or something, right? And it kind of stayed the same. Yeah, please.
Couldn't it also be though that the teacher feels that they're not meeting their own teaching expectations? That I don't know how to really put this, but the student is smarter than their scores are given, so it's actually the teacher's fault that their grades aren't higher.
Yeah, there's a bunch of potential. I don't want to debate the research design, but or delve too deep into it. But yeah, there's potential spurious explanations that you could come up with. And when you read the study, they tried to control for some of those as well. But basically, it's more just an example of a sociological design. Like, how could you create a study that potentially shows, the effect of teacher expectations on IQ, right? So that would be more my takeaway. That was the experiment perfect? But yeah, definitely there could be other things like guilt. The teacher's like, ooh, I'm a bad teacher. That could potentially be there too as well. Okay, we're out of time, so we'll leave it there, and we'll continue talking about this, and we'll talk about validity and all sorts of things on Monday. Have a great weekend. Hello.
I sent you an email yesterday just with my research.
Yes, I haven't quite had a chance to look at it yet, but I did get it, so I will have a look at it. No problem.